To understand U.S. foreign policy today, we need to understand how it was impacted in the past by a significant event, World War II. Coming out of the war, we emerged as one of the world's leading military and economic superpowers. We paid a high price during the war for the security and peace in the world at that point, and we didn't want to lose it. So as such, we adopted a foreign policy that we promoted national security through a diversified economic, political, and military strategy. After World War II, we created several key foreign policy institutions to help meet these goals. In doing so, there were 5 essential activities we engaged in. First was the formation and support of the United Nations. Next was a military buildup to ensure adequate capacity to deal security threats in the emerging environment. Next was the development and growth of the nation's intelligence agencies to provide reliable knowledge about potential enemies. Next was the rebuilding of a war-devastated Europe through the Marshall Plan and the formation of NATO. And finally was the initiation of economic and military assistance to other nations for humanitarian and strategic purposes. Because foreign policy is unique and deals with 2 audiences, remember, a domestic and an international audience, working with those international actors, these sovereign actors, required essentially cooperation. Thus, the United States engaged in the creation and support of the United Nations, with the sole goal of global association of governments, right? That's the cooperation between these sovereign actors, facilitating international law, or essentially a ruling body for these sovereign actors, creating international security or peace, working towards economic development and free trade, and finally, and most recently, the idea of social equity amongst the actors in the United Nations. Basically, an understanding that there are going to be haves and have-nots within the international order. However, we need to prevent some actors from taking advantage of the less fortunate actors in there. This supranational organization, or a multinational union, was created in 1945 with 50 other nations. Today, that number has grown to 193 countries that are member states and 2 countries that are non-member observer states. Those are the State of Palestine and the Holy See, otherwise known as the Pope and the Catholic Church. The goal, if you go back to the UN Charter, was more broadly to promote cooperation and recently manage the effects of globalization. In short, it serves as a vehicle to help countries around the world work together for peace. To do this, it replaced the ineffective League of Nations and worked to prevent a future World War III. Today, the UN has to deal with both the benefits and the curse of globalization, or the interconnectedness of the world countries through trade and communication. Ultimately, the direction of the United Nations is governed by the United Nations Security Council. The Security Council consists of 5 permanent members, each one having veto power over the direction of the UN. In addition to these 5 permanent members, there are 10 rotating elected non-permanent members to give representation to other countries of the world. Taken together, this is the main policy-making body for the United Nations and works to achieve the goals. Yet the UN works with several other affiliated agencies. First, the World Bank, which works to reduce poverty by giving loans to developing nations. Next, the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, which works to stabilize global markets and gives loans to desperate countries. And finally, the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, which regulates international trade and works to promote free trade amongst countries. Together, these international organizations work to create cooperation and peace in an international order. Beyond this, we consider security, both singular and cooperative. One of the most significant policy actions was the National Security Act of 1947. It gave the President significant power to consider national security, military matters, and foreign policy with his or her national security advisors and cabinet officials. The National Security Council is part of the executive office of the President as such. And over time, that role has changed and broadened, most recently to include the environment and energy as part of national security. Beyond this, it also created the National Security Agency, or the NSA, to coordinate, direct, and perform highly specialized activities related to infosystems and information assurance. The NSA also handled the making and breaking of codes and intercepted communications from abroad. Beyond the NSA, we established the CIA, or the Central Intelligence Agency. It grew out of the Office of Strategic Services and conducts foreign covert operations, counterintelligence operations, and collects and analyzes foreign intelligence for the President and his or her staff to aid in national security decisions. We also established the Defense Intelligence Agency, or the DIA, which concentrates on foreign military intelligence information, including battlefield intelligence. And last but not least, have the FBI, which conducts domestic counterintelligence and counterterrorism operations in addition to its role as the lead law enforcement agency in the country. Beyond individual security, we are also concerned with collective security in the world order. And we established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. So why are we concerned with collective security? Well, it takes us back to those two audiences again, both domestic and international. Remember, we can't just go it alone. So why should we form an alliance or a group, which is what NATO was? Well, it gave us legitimately power and also collective action. NATO was initially established to deal with concerns over the growing Soviet Union. When initially it was formed, the United States and the other 11 countries were an alliance of the United States and Western powers, and ultimately agreed to come to the aid of any member state that might be attacked by an aggressor like the USSR. The goal here was collective security. Attack one and you attack them all. In response, the Soviet Union established its own collective security through the Warsaw Pact. But when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1999, well, the Warsaw Pact went with it. Today, NATO has more than 29 countries engaged as member states, as well as a multitude of other partner countries. And arguably, when evaluated according to the evaluative criteria which policy analysts use, this creation of NATO was highly effective and both highly efficient in its goals of collective security.